Sarah Mitchell adjusted her seatbelt for the third time as Flight 447 prepared for takeoff from London Heathrow.
We've got a
The
critical
Boeing
situation up front. We
777
need
was
to
packed
prepare
with the
for an
usual mix
emergency
of
landing.
business travelers and
do we need
tourists
to
heading to New York. She glanced at her boarding pass once more. Seat 5C, middle seat, squeezed between a businessman typing furiously on his laptop and an elderly woman knitting what appeared to be a bright yellow scarf. To everyone around her, Sarah looked like any other passenger. Her jeans and simple sweater gave no hint of her true identity. The worn paperback novel in her hands suggested she was just another traveler looking forward to a quiet flight across the Atlantic. Even her small carry-on bag, tucked neatly under the seat in front of her, appeared ordinary. Nobody would have guessed that this unassuming woman in row 5 held one of the most classified positions in international intelligence. Sarah had been working undercover for MI6 for nearly 8 years. Her specialty was deep cover operations, the kind where she could blend into any crowd and become invisible. Today's flight was supposed to be routine, a simple return journey after completing a successful mission in Eastern Europe. She had spent 3 months posing as a university researcher, gathering intelligence on weapons trafficking networks. The mission had gone perfectly, and she was looking forward to debriefing with her handlers back in London. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their departure. Sarah closed her eyes as the engines roared to life and the massive aircraft began its journey down the runway. She had made this flight countless times, but something felt different today. Maybe it was the exhaustion from her recent assignment, or perhaps it was the strange conversation she had overheard at the airport gate. 2 men in expensive suits had been speaking in hushed tones near the departure lounge. Their conversation had caught her attention because they mentioned a flight number, her flight number. They spoke about a package that needed to be delivered safely and referenced someone called the Guardian. Sarah's training had taught her to notice such details, even when she was officially off duty. But she had dismissed it as business talk, nothing more than coincidence. As the plane climbed through the clouds, Sarah tried to relax. The businessman beside her had finally stopped typing and was now reviewing what looked like financial documents. The elderly woman continued her knitting, the clicking of her needles creating a rhythmic sound that was almost hypnotic. Flight attendants moved efficiently through the cabin, serving drinks and checking on passengers. Everything seemed normal until Sarah noticed something odd. A man in row 12 kept looking back toward her section of the plane. He was well dressed, probably in his 40s, with short gray hair and sharp eyes. Each time Sarah glanced in his direction, he quickly looked away. It could have been nothing, perhaps he was simply restless or looking for a flight attendant. But Sarah's instincts, honed by years of dangerous work, told her otherwise. She decided to test her suspicion. Rising from her seat, she made her way toward the back of the plane, ostensibly heading for the restroom. As she passed row 12, she noticed the man watching her reflection in the window. When she returned to her seat a few minutes later, she took a different route, walking down the opposite aisle. Sure enough, the man had shifted in his seat to maintain visual contact. Sarah's mind began racing through possibilities. Had her cover been blown during the mission? Was someone from the trafficking network following her? Or was this something else entirely? She had been careful to use her civilian identity for the flight booking, complete with a legitimate passport and credit card. There should have been no way for anyone to connect her to her real work. The flight attendant, a cheerful woman named Emma, stopped at her row to offer beverages. "What can I get you, miss?" she asked with a warm smile. "Just water, please," Sarah replied, studying Emma's face carefully. The attendant seemed genuine enough, but Sarah had learned not to trust appearances. As Emma handed her the plastic cup, their fingers touched briefly. Emma's hands were steady, her smile natural. If she was part of whatever was happening, she was either very good at hiding it or completely innocent. 2 hours into the flight, Sarah noticed another troubling development. The man from row 12 had gotten up and spoken quietly with someone seated near the front of the plane. She couldn't see who it was from her position, but the conversation lasted only a few seconds. When the man returned to his seat, he made eye contact with Sarah for the first time. His stare was cold and calculating. Sarah's training kicked into high gear. She began mentally cataloging potential threats and escape routes. The aircraft was cruising at 35,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. Escape wasn't really an option. If something was going to happen, it would happen here, in this confined space with nowhere to run. She considered her options. She could alert the flight crew, but what would she tell them? That she had a feeling something was wrong? That a passenger had looked at her strangely? Without concrete evidence, they would likely dismiss her concerns as travel anxiety. Worse, if there really was a threat, drawing attention to herself might accelerate whatever plan was in motion. Instead, Sarah decided to gather more information. She excused herself again, this time heading toward the front of the plane. As she walked, she counted potential allies among the passengers. The businessman next to her looked physically capable but seemed absorbed in his work. There were a few other men on the flight who might be helpful in a crisis, but Sarah had no way of knowing who she could trust. Near the galley, she pretended to stretch while listening to the flight crew's conversation. They were discussing routine matters, meal service, turbulence reports, arrival procedures. Nothing suggested they were aware of any unusual situation. Either they were excellent actors, or they were as clueless as the rest of the passengers. When Sarah returned to her seat, she found the elderly woman knitting looked at her with knowing eyes. "Restless flight?" the woman asked softly, her voice carrying a slight accent Sarah couldn't place. "Just trying to stretch my legs," Sarah replied carefully. The woman nodded and returned to her knitting, but Sarah caught her stealing glances throughout the next hour. Was everyone on this flight watching her? Paranoia began creeping into her thoughts, but she forced herself to stay calm and analytical. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, announcing they were halfway to New York and experiencing smooth flying conditions. The routine nature of his announcement was somehow comforting, suggesting that whatever was happening was not related to the flight operations themselves. Sarah decided to take a more direct approach. She waited until the man from row 12 got up to use the restroom, then quickly moved to intercept him in the aisle. "Excuse me," she said, blocking his path with an apologetic smile. "I think you dropped this." She held out a pen she had taken from the seat pocket. The man looked at the pen, then at Sarah's face. "That's not mine," he said quietly, his accent suggesting Eastern European origins. "Oh, I'm sorry," Sarah replied, maintaining her innocent act. "I thought I saw you drop it when you got up earlier." "You must be mistaken," the man said, but his eyes were studying her intently. "I haven't dropped anything." As he squeezed past her toward the restroom, Sarah felt a chill. His response had been too careful, too measured. This was definitely not a coincidence. When she returned to her seat, Sarah noticed the elderly woman had stopped knitting and was watching the interaction with interest. Their eyes met briefly, and the woman gave an almost imperceptible nod before returning to her work. Sarah's mind was spinning with questions. Who were these people? What did they want with her? And, most importantly, how had they known she would be on this specific flight? As the hours passed, Sarah began to notice other subtle signs. A woman in row 8 had been reading the same page of her magazine for 45 minutes. Two men seated separately near the back of the plane had synchronized their trips to the restroom. The flight attendant Emma had passed by her row more frequently than necessary, each time glancing at Sarah with what seemed like concern. The pieces of a larger puzzle were starting to form, but Sarah couldn't see the complete picture yet. What she did know was that her quiet return journey had become something much more complicated and potentially dangerous. She thought about the code name the men at the airport had mentioned, the Guardian. In intelligence circles, code names usually referred to operations, assets, or high-value targets. Sarah had never heard this particular designation before, but that didn't mean it wasn't connected to her somehow. As Flight 447 continued its journey across the dark Atlantic, Sarah realized that her years of training were about to be put to the ultimate test. Whatever was happening, she was no longer just a passenger in Seat 5C. She was back in the game, whether she wanted to be or not. The elderly woman beside her had finished several rows of her knitting, the yellow yarn forming an intricate pattern that seemed almost like a coded message. Sarah studied it carefully, wondering if she was seeing patterns where none existed or if everything on this flight was exactly what it appeared to be. Outside the aircraft windows, nothing but darkness and ocean stretched in all directions. Inside, Sarah Mitchell sat quietly in row 5, looking like any other passenger while her mind worked frantically to understand the deadly game that seemed to be unfolding around her. The flight was only half over, and already she knew that by the time they reached New York, nothing would ever be the same again. Sarah's suspicions were confirmed during the meal service. As flight attendant Emma reached her row with the dinner cart, she leaned down slightly while placing Sarah's meal on her tray table. "The captain would like to speak with you," she whispered so quietly that only Sarah could hear. Sarah's blood ran cold. How did the captain know who she was? She had booked this flight under her civilian identity, complete with a false profession and background. There should have been no way for anyone to connect her to her intelligence work, especially not the flight crew. "I think there's been a mistake," Sarah whispered back, maintaining her confused passenger act. Emma's expression remained professional, but her eyes were serious. "Please come to the front galley in 5 minutes. Use the restroom as an excuse." She moved on to the next passenger without another word, leaving Sarah staring at her untouched meal. The businessman beside her noticed her pale complexion. "Are you feeling all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just tired," Sarah managed, forcing a weak smile. "Long day of traveling." She spent the next few minutes trying to understand how her cover had been blown. Her passport was legitimate, issued under her Sarah Mitchell civilian identity. Her credit card, address, employment history, everything checked out because it was real. She had lived as Sarah Mitchell for years, building an authentic background that could withstand scrutiny. The only explanation was that someone had identified her physically, but that seemed impossible. Her last mission had been in a completely different part of Europe, dealing with people who had no connection to aviation or air travel. Unless... Sarah's mind raced back to the weapons trafficking investigation she had just completed. One of the suspects had been a former airline pilot who had lost his license due to smuggling charges. Could there be a connection? Had someone from that network recognized her and somehow gotten word to someone on this flight? 5 minutes felt like an eternity, but finally, Sarah stood up and made her way toward the front of the plane. The man from row 12 was watching again, and she noticed he had his hand resting near what looked like a small device in his seat pocket. The elderly woman had stopped knitting entirely and was following Sarah's movement with sharp eyes. Emma was waiting in the forward galley, along with another flight attendant Sarah hadn't noticed before, a tall man with graying temples who looked more like security than airline staff. "Miss Mitchell," the male attendant said quietly, "I'm David. I work for the same organization you do, though in a different capacity. We need to talk." Sarah's training told her to deny everything, but something in David's manner suggested he already knew far more than he should. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said carefully. David pulled out what appeared to be a normal airline ID badge, but when he turned it over, Sarah saw the coded authentication marks that identified him as MI6 support staff. "We don't have much time," he said. "Your extraction from your last mission didn't go as smoothly as you think." "What are you talking about?" Sarah whispered, glancing around to make sure no other passengers were watching. "I completed the mission and left clean. There were no complications." Emma moved closer, speaking in barely audible tones. 3 hours after you left your hotel in Prague, the local police found 2 bodies in the building across the street. Professional killers, by all accounts. They had surveillance equipment trained on your room." Sarah felt the world shift beneath her feet. "That's impossible. I followed protocol exactly. Nobody knew where I was staying." "Someone did," David said grimly. "And they've been tracking you ever since. We intercepted communications indicating that there would be an attempt on your life during this flight." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. "Then, why didn't you pull me off the flight? Why let me board if you knew?" David's expression was grave. "Because we need to know who's behind this. Your mission uncovered more than just weapons trafficking. You stumbled onto something much bigger, and someone very powerful wants you dead before you can report what you learned." Sarah thought back to her last few days in Prague. She had been investigating a relatively simple smuggling operation, tracking stolen military weapons being sold to terrorist groups. It was important work, but hardly the kind of thing that would warrant assassination attempts by professional killers. "What did I miss?" she asked. "What did I find that was so important?" Emma glanced toward the cabin before responding. "The weapons you were tracking weren't just stolen military surplus. Some of them were prototypes, experimental technology that doesn't officially exist. Someone has been using the trafficking network to move classified weapons research out of government facilities." The pieces began falling into place in Sarah's mind. During her investigation, she had photographed serial numbers and markings on various weapons, thinking they would help track the source of the theft. What if those markings had revealed something she hadn't understood at the time? "The photos," Sarah whispered. "I documented everything I found." David nodded. "And those photos are currently sitting in a secure server, waiting for your debriefing. Someone wants to make sure that debriefing never happens." "So who's on the plane?" Sarah asked, thinking about the man from row 12 and the other suspicious passengers. "We're still identifying them," Emma admitted. "But we know there are at least 3 hostiles aboard, possibly more. They've been very careful to appear like normal passengers." Sarah's mind was racing through implications and strategies. "What's the plan? How do we handle this?" David looked uncomfortable. "Officially, we're supposed to wait until after landing and let ground teams handle the situation. But intelligence suggests they plan to make their move before we reach New York." "During the flight?" "It's the perfect place, really," Emma explained. "Contained environment, limited escape routes, and if something goes wrong, it can be made to look like an accident. Planes crash, unfortunately. Investigators might never determine the real cause." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the aircraft's air conditioning. "So what are we really doing here? What's the actual plan?" David and Emma exchanged a look that suggested they had been having this conversation before Sarah arrived. "We're going to need your help," David said finally. "But first, you need to understand something important about your identity on this flight." "What do you mean?" Emma pulled out a tablet and showed Sarah something that made her heart skip a beat. It was a passenger manifest, and next to her civilian name was a notation she had never seen before: Guardian 7, priority asset. "Guardian," Sarah breathed, remembering the code name she had heard at the airport. They weren't talking about an operation. They were talking about me. "The Guardian protocol is something new," David explained. "It's a classification for intelligence assets who have stumbled onto information so sensitive that they become targets for elimination. You're the 7th person to receive this designation. What happened to the first 6? The silence that followed was answer enough. Emma checked her watch. "We need to get you back to your seat before people start noticing." "But, Sarah, you need to know, the captain is aware of the situation. If things go bad, he's prepared to take evasive action." "Evasive action?" "We're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. There are protocols," David said vaguely. "Let's hope we don't need them." As Sarah prepared to return to her seat, David grabbed her arm gently. "One more thing. The elderly woman sitting next to you, she's not what she appears to be either." Sarah's eyes widened. "Is she one of them?" "No," Emma said with a slight smile. "She's one of us. Margaret has been doing this longer than any of us. If things go wrong, trust her." Walking back to row 5, Sarah's mind was spinning with this new information. The knitting elderly woman was an undercover agent. The flight crew were intelligence operatives. The man from row 12 was a professional killer. And she, Sarah Mitchell, was apparently important enough that someone was willing to orchestrate an elaborate mid-flight assassination attempt. When she reached her seat, the elderly woman, Margaret, looked up from her knitting with a grandmother's smile. "How was your walk, dear?" "Enlightening," Sarah replied carefully, settling back into her middle seat. Margaret's fingers never paused in their knitting, but she spoke in a voice so low only Sarah could hear. "The gentleman in 12A has been checking his watch every few minutes for the past hour. I suspect he's working to a timeline. Sarah glanced discreetly toward row 12. The man was indeed checking his watch, and now she noticed he was also paying attention to the flight progress map on the screens throughout the cabin. How long have you known? Sarah asked quietly. Known what, dear? Margaret replied, but her eyes twinkled with understanding. How long have you known who I am? Margaret smiled. Since you sat down, Guardian 7. Your photograph was in my briefing materials. Sarah realized she was sitting in the middle of an operation she hadn't known existed. What exactly is happening here? We're going fishing, Margaret said cryptically, her needles clicking in a rhythm that almost sounded like coded communication. And you, my dear, are the bait. The businessman on Sarah's other side suddenly looked up from his laptop. Excuse me, he said politely, but I couldn't help overhearing. Are you ladies discussing the flight time? I have an important meeting when we land. Margaret's knitting needles stopped moving. Sarah noticed that the man's question, while innocent enough, had been perfectly timed to interrupt their conversation at the most crucial moment. Just chatting about travel, Margaret replied sweetly. Nothing important. The businessman smiled and returned to his laptop, but Sarah noticed he had positioned the screen so she couldn't see what he was working on. Another coincidence in a flight that was proving to have far too many of them. As the plane continued its journey through the dark Atlantic night, Sarah realized she was no longer just a passenger or even just an intelligence asset in danger. She was a piece in a much larger game, and the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. The question was, who was really in control of this game, and would she survive long enough to find out? The turning point came during what should have been the most routine part of the flight. Sarah was pretending to doze when she heard the businessman beside her typing in an unusual pattern on his laptop. As someone trained in communication codes, she recognized it immediately. He wasn't working on documents. He was sending a coded message. The typing pattern was deliberate: 3 short bursts, pause, 2 long sequences, pause, repeat. It was a variation of Morse code that intelligence services sometimes used for covert communication. Sarah kept her eyes closed and listened carefully, translating the pattern in her mind. Package confirmed. Execute at marker 7. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Package had to refer to her, and marker 7 likely meant some specific point in the flight, possibly 7 hours into the journey, or perhaps when they reached a certain geographical marker. Either way, it meant the assassination attempt was imminent. She opened her eyes slightly and noticed Margaret had also been listening. The elderly woman's knitting needles had stopped moving, and her posture was more alert despite her continued appearance of harmless grandmother. The businessman finished his typing and closed the laptop. He stood up and headed toward the rear of the plane, ostensibly to use the restroom but more likely to communicate with his accomplices. Sarah counted slowly to 30, then got up and followed at a distance. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. The businessman was speaking quietly with the man from row 12 and another passenger Sarah hadn't previously identified as suspicious, a woman in her 30s with short blonde hair who was seated near the back. All three were huddled together, speaking in hushed tones near the rear galley. Sarah pretended to be looking for something in the overhead compartment while straining to hear their conversation. She caught fragments: control cabin, pilot compliance, make it look like. And, most chillingly, no survivors. This wasn't just about eliminating her. They were planning to destroy the entire aircraft to ensure she never reached her debriefing. 250 innocent passengers and crew were going to die because of information Sarah carried without even knowing its true importance. She returned to her seat with a new sense of urgency. Margaret looked up from her knitting expectantly. "They're not just after me," Sarah whispered. "They're planning to take down the whole plane." Margaret's needles resumed their clicking, but now Sarah could see the old woman's hands were steady and controlled, the hands of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. "How much time do we have?" "I don't know." They mentioned something called marker 7. Margaret's eyes sharpened. "We're currently about 6 hours into an 8-hour flight. Marker 7 probably refers to the 7-hour point about 1 hour from now. What can we do? First, we need to warn David and Emma. Then, we need to identify all the hostile operatives on board. Margaret's voice remained conversational, but Sarah could hear the steel beneath the grandmother act. Sarah stood up again, this time heading toward the front galley. She needed to update David and Emma on what she had learned. As she walked, she tried to identify any other suspicious passengers she might have missed. A man in row 9 was reading a newspaper, but Sarah noticed he hadn't turned a page in over 20 minutes. A woman across the aisle kept checking her phone despite the cabin crew's repeated announcements about electronic devices. Small things, but, in aggregate, they painted a picture of people who were focused on something other than normal passenger activities. Emma was serving coffee to passengers in first class when Sarah approached. "Excuse me," Sarah said politely, "I'm feeling a bit airsick. Could I get some ginger ale?" It was a pre-arranged code phrase David had given her. Emma's expression didn't change, but she nodded and guided Sarah into the front galley where David was waiting. "What's the situation?" David asked immediately. Sarah quickly explained what she had overheard: the coded message, the meeting at the rear of the plane, and the reference to Marker 7. David's face grew grim. "That matches our intelligence timeline. We intercepted communications suggesting something would happen during the 7th hour of flight." "How many of them are there?" Sarah asked. "We've identified at least 5 confirmed hostiles, possibly more." Emma pulled out a tablet showing the passenger manifest with several names highlighted. "The challenge is they're spread throughout the cabin, and some of them may not know about the others. It's a compartmentalized operation." "What about the pilots? Are they safe?" David hesitated. "We believe so, but we can't be certain. The cockpit door is locked and secure, but if they have someone among the crew..." "They do," Sarah said, realizing something she should have noticed earlier. "The flight attendant who served my row earlier, not Emma, the other one. She was asking very specific questions about passenger comfort, but she was really gathering information about who was alert and who might be a problem." Emma cursed under her breath. "Linda. I knew something felt off about her transfer to this flight. So they have inside access to the cabin crew communications and, possibly, the cockpit." David was thinking through the implications. "That means they can coordinate their actions and, potentially, take control of the aircraft systems." Sarah felt the walls closing in around them. "What are our options?" "Limited," David admitted. "We can't involve local authorities because we're over international waters. Air marshals might not be equipped to handle this level of coordination. And if we alert the captain through normal channels, we risk Linda intercepting the communication." "What about Margaret? How much backup do we actually have?" Emma looked surprised. "Margaret told you who she was?" "Sort of. She's been hinting that she's more than she appears." David smiled grimly. "Margaret Thompson. 40-year veteran of the intelligence services. She's handled situations like this before, just not usually at 35,000 feet." "So what's the plan?" David and Emma exchanged glances. "We're making it up as we go," David admitted. "But here's what we know: they need to wait until Marker 7 for whatever reason, probably to ensure maximum distance from any potential rescue operations. That gives us about 50 minutes to figure out how to stop them." "Stop them from doing what, exactly?" "Best guess?" "They're going to try to gain access to the cockpit and either force the pilots to crash the plane or take control themselves. Either way, they'll make it look like pilot error or mechanical failure." Sarah thought about the layout of the aircraft and the position of the known hostiles. "They'll need to create a distraction to mask their real objective. Something that draws attention away from their actual target." "Agreed. Which means we need to be ready for multiple simultaneous actions." Emma checked her watch. "I need to get back to my duties before Linda notices I'm missing." "David, can you brief Margaret on the current situation?" "Already done. She's been listening to our conversation through the communication system." David touched a small device in his ear that Sarah hadn't noticed before. She can hear us? Margaret has resources you wouldn't expect. Let's just say she's very well connected. As they prepared to return to their positions, David grabbed Sarah's arm. One more thing. Your photographs from Prague, the ones with the weapon serial numbers. Do you remember any specific details about them? Sarah closed her eyes and tried to recall. Her memory had been trained to retain visual details with photographic accuracy. There were several weapons with markings I didn't recognize. Some had what looked like prototype designations, series numbers that didn't match any standard military inventory I knew about. Do you remember any specific codes or numbers? One stood out because it was so unusual. It was marked Blackwater 7 with a series of numbers below it. David's face went white. Oh, God. What? What is Blackwater 7? It's not a weapons program, David said quietly. It's an assassination protocol. A way of eliminating high-value targets by making their deaths look accidental. You didn't just photograph stolen weapons, Sarah. You documented evidence of a government black ops program that's supposed to not exist. The magnitude of the situation finally hit Sarah. She wasn't just carrying information about weapons trafficking. She had inadvertently uncovered evidence of an illegal assassination program being run by someone within the government. No wonder they were willing to destroy an entire airliner to silence her. Who's running it? We don't know. But, whoever it is has enough power to coordinate this kind of operation and enough resources to place multiple assets on a transatlantic flight. Sarah returned to her seat with a new understanding of why she had become such a valuable target. As she sat down, Margaret looked up from her knitting with a knowing expression. Figured it out, did you? The elderly woman asked softly. Some of it. But, I still don't understand why they're waiting for marker 7. Why not just act now? Margaret's needles clicked thoughtfully. Because they need something specific to happen at that point. My guess is they're waiting for a predetermined signal or event that will provide cover for their actions. What kind of signal? Could be anything. A weather system, a specific geographical location, or... Margaret paused, her expression growing concerned. Or they're waiting for outside assistance. What do you mean? Think about it, dear. If you want to make a plane crash look like an accident, what's the best way to do it? Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Mechanical failure, pilot error, or interference from an outside source. Something that would explain why the aircraft suddenly deviated from its flight path and crashed into the ocean. The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. They're not just going to take control of the plane. They're going to make it disappear. Margaret nodded grimly. And, in about 45 minutes, we're going to find out exactly how they plan to do it. As if on cue, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our approach to marker 7. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened as we may experience some turbulence ahead. Sarah and Margaret exchanged glances. The game was about to begin, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The next 45 minutes would determine whether they exposed the truth about Blackwater 7 or became another unexplained aviation mystery lost in the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. The first sign that marker 7 had arrived came not from the conspirators, but from an unexpected source. Sarah felt her ears pop as the cabin pressure changed slightly, and she noticed the aircraft beginning a subtle descent that wasn't part of the normal flight profile. Margaret's knitting needles stopped moving entirely. That's not supposed to happen yet, she whispered. Through the small window, Sarah could see they were flying through a layer of clouds that seemed unusually thick for this part of the Atlantic. The aircraft was shaking more than normal, but this felt different from typical turbulence, more controlled, more deliberate. The businessman beside her had been unusually quiet for the past 20 minutes, but now he was checking his watch every few seconds. His laptop remained closed, but Sarah noticed he had positioned his carry-on bag where he could reach it quickly. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison. The voice over the intercom sounded strained. We're experiencing some unexpected weather patterns and we'll need to make a slight course adjustment. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Margaret leaned closer to Sarah. That wasn't Captain Morrison's voice. What do you mean? I've been on enough flights to recognize voices. The captain who welcomed us aboard at the beginning had a different accent, different speech patterns. That was someone else. Sarah's heart began racing. If someone had gained access to the cockpit and was already impersonating the captain, their situation had just become desperate. She glanced around the cabin and noticed that several of the suspicious passengers were now moving simultaneously. The man from row 12 was walking toward the front of the plane. The blonde woman from the back was heading toward the middle section. The businessman beside Sarah was reaching into his bag. It was happening exactly as David had predicted, multiple coordinated actions designed to overwhelm any resistance. Margaret suddenly dropped her knitting and grabbed Sarah's wrist with surprising strength. When I give the signal, move toward the rear of the plane as fast as you can. Don't look back, don't hesitate, just run. What about you? I'll be fine, dear. I've been doing this since before you were born. The aircraft shuddered again, more violently this time. Through the window, Sarah could see they were descending more rapidly now, and the ocean was becoming visible below the cloud cover. If the conspirators had gained control of the aircraft, they were already beginning their final approach to disaster. The businessman beside Sarah suddenly stood up and blocked the aisle. "Excuse me," he said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "but I think this lady needs medical attention. She appears to be having some kind of panic attack." It was a clever move. Creating a medical emergency would provide cover for whatever else was about to happen. But Margaret was ready for it. "Oh my," she said in her grandmother voice, but her eyes were sharp and alert. "I do feel a bit faint. Could someone help me to the restroom?" As she stood up, Margaret stumbled slightly and bumped into the businessman. To any observer, it looked like an elderly woman having balance problems. But Sarah saw Margaret's hand move in a lightning-fast motion, and suddenly, the businessman was gasping and clutching his throat. "Now," Margaret whispered urgently. Sarah bolted from her seat and ran toward the rear of the plane. Behind her, she could hear confusion spreading as passengers tried to understand what was happening to the businessman, who was now collapsing in the aisle. As she reached the back galley, Sarah found chaos. David and Emma were struggling with the blonde woman, who had produced some kind of small weapon and was trying to reach the crew communication panel. The flight attendant Linda was nowhere to be seen, which probably meant she was already involved in whatever was happening in the cockpit. "The pilots!" Sarah shouted over the noise. "Someone's taken control of the cockpit." David managed to subdue the blonde woman with Emma's help, using plastic restraints that seemed to appear from nowhere. "We know," he said grimly. "Margaret's been in communication with the real Captain Morrison. He's locked in a storage compartment behind the cockpit." "Then, who's flying the plane?" "Linda and at least one other person. They have enough flight training to operate the basic controls, but not enough to land safely. Which means they never intended to land at all." The aircraft was descending more rapidly now, and Sarah could feel the change in engine pressure. Through the small windows in the rear galley, the ocean was getting noticeably closer. "What can we do?" Emma was checking something on a handheld device. "The cockpit door has electronic locks, but there are override codes. The problem is we need to get close enough to use them." "What about the other passengers?" "They're going to panic when they realize what's happening." "Some of them already have," David said, nodding toward the main cabin where raised voices could be heard. "But Margaret's handling the situation." Indeed, from where Sarah stood, she could see Margaret moving through the cabin with surprising efficiency. The elderly woman was somehow managing to calm panicking passengers while simultaneously identifying and neutralizing the remaining hostile operatives. Sarah watched in amazement as Margaret approached a man in row 9 who had been reading the same newspaper for hours. Within seconds, he was unconscious in his seat, and Margaret continued her progress as if nothing had happened. "How is she doing that?" "Trade secrets," David replied. "Margaret has resources and training that most people in our line of work can only dream about." A new voice came over the intercom, female this time, and definitely not one of the original crew. "Passengers, please remain calm. We are experiencing technical difficulties and will be making an emergency landing. Follow all crew instructions and prepare for impact." Emergency landing? Sarah looked out the window at the endless ocean. "There's nowhere to land out here." "Exactly," Emma said grimly. "They're planning to crash the plane into the ocean and make it look like pilot error or mechanical failure. By the time rescue teams reach the debris field, any evidence of what really happened will be at the bottom of the Atlantic." David was working frantically with some kind of electronic device. "I'm trying to override the cockpit controls from here, but they've changed the access codes." "What about the emergency transponder? Can't we signal for help?" "They've disabled it. As far as air traffic control knows, we're still on our normal flight path. They won't realize anything is wrong until we fail to check in at the next waypoint, and, by then, it will be too late." Sarah felt the aircraft banking sharply to the left, and the descent became even steeper. Through the windows, she could see they were now flying very low over the ocean, low enough that she could make out individual waves in the water below. "We're running out of time," she said. Emma nodded. "David, how long until impact at this rate of descent?" David checked his calculations. "Maybe 10 minutes. 15 at most." Margaret appeared in the rear galley, moving with remarkable speed for someone her age. "All hostiles in the main cabin are neutralized," she reported crisply. "But we still have the problem of Linda and whoever else is in the cockpit." "Can you override the door locks?" Sarah asked. "Not from here. But there is another way." Margaret pulled out what looked like a normal smartphone, but when she opened it, Sarah could see it was far more sophisticated than any civilian device. "I can patch into the aircraft's communication system and potentially regain control of some functions." "Do it," David said. "We don't have any other options." As Margaret worked with her device, the aircraft shuddered violently and the lights flickered. Whatever the people in the cockpit were doing, they were pushing the aircraft beyond its normal operational parameters. "There," Margaret said after a few tense seconds. "I've regained access to the passenger communication system. Sarah, I need you to do exactly as I say." "What do you need?" "Go back to your seat and act like a normal passenger. When I give the signal over the intercom, I need you to create a very specific distraction." "What kind of distraction?" Margaret handed her a small device that looked like an asthma inhaler. "This contains a chemical compound that will produce a large amount of harmless but dramatic smoke when activated. When you hear me announce that the captain wants to speak with all passengers, activate this device and, then, shout that there's a fire in the cabin." Sarah understood immediately. "You want to force them out of the cockpit." "Exactly. If they think the passenger cabin is on fire, they'll have to investigate or risk losing control of the situation. The moment that cockpit door opens, David and I will be ready." "What if they don't fall for it?" Margaret's expression was determined. "Then, we'll have to try something more direct." Sarah made her way back through the cabin, passing unconscious operatives and confused but calm passengers. Margaret had somehow managed to maintain order despite the aircraft's increasingly erratic behavior. As Sarah reached row 5, she was amazed to find that most passengers seemed to believe they were simply experiencing unusual turbulence. She sat down in her seat and waited, the small smoke device hidden in her palm. Outside the window, the ocean was getting closer by the minute. Whatever they were going to do, it had to happen soon. Margaret's voice came over the intercom, sounding exactly like a normal flight attendant. "Ladies and gentlemen, the captain would like to address all passengers regarding our current situation. Please remain seated while he prepares his announcement." Sarah activated the device. Immediately, thick white smoke began pouring from her seat area. "Fire," she shouted as loudly as she could. "There's a fire in the cabin." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Passengers throughout the cabin began shouting and pointing at the growing cloud of smoke. Emergency lighting activated automatically, and alarm systems began sounding. Within seconds, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of the cockpit door's electronic locks disengaging. Linda appeared first, followed by a man Sarah didn't recognize, probably the person who had been impersonating Captain Morrison. They had fallen for it completely. The moment they stepped into the main cabin, David and Margaret were on them. The takedown was swift and professional, and, within minutes both intruders were restrained. The real pilots! Emma shouted over the noise of the alarms. Where are they? Linda, now in plastic restraints, nodded toward the front of the aircraft. Storage compartment behind the cockpit. The captain is unconscious but alive. David and Emma raced toward the front of the plane while Margaret worked to shut off the smoke device and calm the passengers. Sarah remained in her seat, amazed that their desperate plan had actually worked. 10 minutes later, Captain Morrison's familiar voice came over the intercom, the real Captain Morrison this time. Ladies and gentlemen, we've resolved our technical difficulties and are resuming normal flight operations. We apologize for the inconvenience and will be providing a full explanation once we reach our destination safely. Sarah felt the aircraft begin to climb back to its normal altitude, and the view outside her window changed from terrifyingly close ocean waves to the more reassuring sight of distant clouds. Margaret returned to her seat and picked up her knitting as if nothing had happened. Well, that was exciting, she said with a grandmother's smile. Is it really over? The immediate danger, yes. But the larger problem, the Blackwater 7 program and whoever's running it, that's just beginning. What happens now? Now you give your debriefing and provide those photographs. And people much more important than any of us decide how to handle the fact that someone within our own government has been running illegal assassination operations. As Flight 447 continued its journey toward New York, Sarah realized that her life had changed forever. She was no longer just an intelligence operative who had stumbled onto something important. She was now the key witness in what could be the biggest scandal in intelligence history. The man who had been sitting next to her, the businessman with the laptop, was being taken away by air marshals who had apparently been on board all along. Sarah wondered how many other people on the flight were not who they appeared to be. Margaret, she said quietly, how did you know this was going to happen? The elderly woman's needles clicked rhythmically as she worked on her yellow scarf. Sometimes, dear, the best way to catch the wolves is to stake out the lamb. You mean I was bait? The best kind of bait that doesn't know it's bait. Your reactions were completely genuine because you had no idea what was really happening. Sarah stared at Margaret with new understanding. How long have you been watching me? Since your second mission for MI6. We've known for months that someone was targeting our deep cover operatives. You were the perfect candidate to help us identify the leak. And if the plan had failed? If they had succeeded in crashing the plane? Margaret's expression grew serious. Then, 250 people would have died, including some very good agents. But we would have learned who was behind Blackwater 7, and that information might have prevented thousands of other deaths. That's a hell of a risk to take. This is a hell of a job, dear. As the plane settled into its normal flight routine for the remaining hours to New York, Sarah found herself looking at her fellow passengers with new eyes. How many of them were exactly who they appeared to be? How many were playing roles in games they didn't even know existed? One thing was certain, her days as a simple undercover operative were over. The photographs on her camera and the knowledge in her head had made her one of the most important people in the intelligence community. Whether that was a promotion or a death sentence remained to be seen. Margaret finished another row of her knitting and glanced at Sarah with knowing eyes. Welcome to the big leagues, Guardian 7. I hope you're ready for what comes next. Sarah looked out the window at the vast Atlantic Ocean below, thinking about how close they had all come to disappearing forever beneath those dark waters. Whatever came next, she was alive to face it. For now, that was enough.